some of you work for the police, and sorry, just there. Continue. Sorry. So normally you have those persons who work in the private sector. The exceptions of in the rule is when some of you who might work for the police or the Hawks. But so obviously when we try and apply a certain interviewing technique, it's important to take into account it has to be admissible, the evidence that we get from that interview, in a private setting as well, because the mandate isn't as great as you want, as what you would have in a normal police setting, for example. So there are a couple of things in this context that we have to take into account. Firstly, the legal framework. Obviously, we want the information to be admissible in the court of law, so we have to take into account the Constitution, the Criminal Procedure Act, and other statutory laws, obviously, as well. So I'm not going to delve into that. What's also important in the context of interviewing is that there are obviously different types of interviewing techniques. There's no standard interviewing technique. We all know this. There are different techniques that we might apply, and that's what we're going to touch on today. And obviously, there are also different interviewees. Now, I find some of the students and some of the early investigators struggling with this concept is, if you talk to the client, it's already actually a type of forensic interview because it will influence your investigation in general. So it's good to see when you talk to the client as well, if you talk to third parties, if you talk to a witness, to see that as a forensic interview and that you apply that technique when you talk to those persons as well, the process owners. So it's not only the suspects, but obviously talking to the suspects is very important, and doing it in a legal manner and gaining that information. But I think it's important also to understand the context that when we apply this interview technique, it also applies to the third parties, the client, the process owners. Let's say you're doing an investigation at a very intricate brewing company, how to understand the processes. Obviously, you can use an interviewing technique to talk to the process owners and gain their trust as well. Because if you gain their trust, they will give you more reliable information. And then again, the context of the virus that we're sitting with now. Another core aspect for us to realize when we do interviewing is the humanistic psychology thereof. Remember now from the theoretical underpinnings, the research that has been done. Not of Sergeant van der Merwe who's sitting in Pofadder, for example. And again, we'll talk about that now. There might be some great things that you've seen over the last 20 years that we might apply in practice. But we're talking now about the theoretical aspects. And the humanistic psychology is very important because we deal with humans. So it's very intricate. And again, if we talk to someone even via Zoom, the human aspects are important because that person is a human being with emotions and it will influence the information that we get, even though we're sitting in front of a screen. So that's important for us to know. And additionally, you as the interviewer, you have a great influence on the interview. And that is something we forget on various occasions, is that we think we do this interview and this person will give us information. Boom, you must speak now. We want this information as part of the investigation. But in actual fact, you are an active participant. And I think all of us know this, but when it comes to practicing it, when it comes to practice, sometimes what happens is we forget that we are an active participant and we forget that we might influence the interview. And therefore, we just expect the person to come out with the truth. But in essence, maybe we're the stumbling block, creating the person, an atmosphere for the person not willing to share information. So that's an important aspect in the context as we have to take into account as well. And again, the effect of the virus, especially, well, due to the lockdown, but also when we want to gain the trust of a person. And how do you assess how the person is feeling to test what he or she is feeling at that time in order to gain rapport? And we'll talk about that just now. Obviously, sitting in front of a screen makes it more difficult. Looking at those verbal and non-verbal cues to see whether the person is anxious or experiencing stress becomes very difficult in this current environment. So that is the context. Now, again, picture person. So again, you have to excuse my grade 5 colors here, but hopefully it'll help us to remember. So in essence, when we talk about forensic interviewing, we get a practical side or practical techniques that we apply. Again, that's Sergeant van der Merwe, who has done this for 20 years. and he knows now how to interview a person. You sit with your back against the door so that the person feels a bit more stressful. You look over his left shoulder, you rub your nose, and then he becomes influenced and he will give you the information. That's just an example, and a very elementary example. But these are known as informal techniques. They might have value, but they're not tried and tested through research. And then we get the theoretical side, the formal theoretical underpinned techniques, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So that's the first aspect, the formal techniques. Within the formal techniques, there are two broad families of interviewing techniques. Again, through research that we found out. You get the guilt presumptive family of techniques and the investigative interviewing techniques. The guilt presumptive technique is self-explanatory. Its aim is to establish guilt via confession. So when you step into that interview, your aim, your goal is to get a confession because you know that the person has already committed the crime. And an example of that is the Reed technique. I'm sure you've heard of that. That's Horatio and all his colleagues on CSI. He sits there and the person sits there for about 10, 12 hours till he says or he admits that he's committed the crime. And what links with that is the behavioral analysis interview, where there are kinetic cues that links with the Reed technique. And we'll deal with that a bit later as well. And then you get the investigative interviewing techniques. And the sole aim of these family of techniques is to obtain reliable information. And within this grouping, you get numerous investigative interviewing techniques, more than that we're going to touch on today, but I just want to touch on the main ones: the cognitive interviewing technique, the peace model, and the person-centered approach. Now, with this broader picture, what do we apply in the South African context? Still, there's a lot of research to be done, but initial research indicates that it's probably better, specifically in the commercial forensic context that we operate in, to apply investigative techniques. That second family, if you can go back, the investigative group. Why? Because again, if we look at the context, firstly, international authors, most of them subscribe to the investigative techniques due to some legal questions arising from the Reed technique in America, but also due to our current or specific context, the private sector that we operate in, a lot of us. So we don't have that extended mandate. The legal context, as we mentioned, the type of interviewee that we're dealing with, it's not necessarily a robber where we say, sit down, you won't get any water till you tell the truth. These are intricate human beings, CEOs sometimes, that we have to interview, and the effects of the lockdown. So if we look at these contexts, and I don't want to go into depth because we have limited time, but in essence, it comes down to the initial research indicates that these investigative interviewing techniques will work better in the South African context. And with that, we're busy with research to see how we can merge two of those interviewing techniques, as Chris mentioned. And as part of those informal techniques, I know a lot of you have got great substance which we can use when we try to create this hybrid technique from the theoretical side and the practical side. And I'm very excited as part of this research project in the next 2 to 3 years to talk to all of you and get your feedback of what works, what doesn't work. And so expect a call from me in the near future, and we'll talk about your experiences, and perhaps the theoretical aspects might help you as well in the process. So just a quick recap. If we look at the cognitive interviewing technique, that's where you go back into cognition. It links with the hypnotic interview. I don't want to go in depth with regards to that, but there are some new developments and exciting developments. Specifically, if we look there at the bottom, the self-administered interview, the SAI. Now, my colleague at the University of London, Professor Fiona Gabbard, she's busy with some great research with regards to the self-administered interview. She works with police. And how this works is, whereas in the past where you had a crime and the witness would normally go to the police station and give their testimony of what happened and supply their written statement, the research indicates that the longer you take after the crime has been committed until you give your written statement, the less accurate the information becomes. So with the self-administered interview, they're actually applying it now in London, is when you experience the crime, you go online and you report the crime. You give your written statement by yourself, administrating it by yourself. Now, it sounds a bit shaky, doesn't it? But it actually works. And so I'm very excited to also look at aspects within economic crime. Obviously, when you have a violent crime, it's a lot easier to immediately afterwards go online and give your version of what happened. Whereas with economic crime, it's years and years of a person stealing and being manipulative and stowing away the information. But sometimes you do get witnesses who hear important things as part of an economic crime situation. And also, you might also find some of these, sorry, just want to see my camera. You also might find, you almost also find instances where witnesses might hear something that's important, but also the whistleblowers. I mean, you can think the future that awaits us if we can apply the self-administered interview in the whistleblowing context. So a lot of exciting stuff in research that we're looking at. As a background, it's important to take the kinetic interviewing technique into account when you do an interview in the South African context, based on the theory and research. The background essence is to obviously take into account how a person reacts to your line of questioning. To identify, not according to the BAI as part of that guilt presumptive interviewing technique, where it says you can identify deception. That's not the truth. You can, however, identify stress, discomfort, or anxiety as part of the kinetic interviewing technique. And that's important for us. If we can identify stress or discomfort, we might come across the truth. So it is important to take that into account when doing an interview. So I think some of you might have seen the series Lie to Me, where you've seen where you look at the verbal and non-verbal cues of the person. That was a bit Hollywood illustration of how that works. But in essence, it comes down to the same thing. You have verbal cues, what the person is saying, the choice of words, how long he's talking, giving too much information about a certain situation, which might create doubts as to whether the person is actually talking the truth, creating too much of a narrative, or giving not enough. And then also the paralinguistic cues, where the person's tone or the sounds he's making might influence the interview as well. The type of is he talking a high-pitched tone? It can help us to identify discomfort or stress. And then obviously the non-verbal cues are very important. The body language. Is the person looking down? Is he rubbing his nose the whole time? Is he jittery? Now that is science in its own sense, and that will take a whole workshop of 3 days to really apply that in your settings. But I just want to, again, create the context of taking notes of how the person is reacting to your questions and your presence, even though it might be on Zoom. Okay, so that's the context. And I'm going to refer back to the kinetic cues when we merge these two models. So the peace model and the person-centered approach, we've done some initial research, very possible attributes that might help us within the South African context. The peace model has got great structure. It's got that acronym, we'll get to that now. And the person-centered approach has got very good content, very strong theoretical underpinnings. The humanistic psychology plays an important part as part of the person-centered approach. So if we could merge these two, and this is what this whole research is about, it might help us a whole lot. Let's have a look again at the person-centered approach. Again, we've had the workshop 2 years ago. I'm not going to go into depth, but in essence, it comes down to the person has to come to a level of self-actualization where he accepts him or herself, and very important, we have to create rapport in this whole process. Gaining the trust of the interviewee is the essence. And in this context, it becomes very difficult, again, if you're doing a Zoom interview, to gain the trust of a person if she's not sitting in front of you. But I promise you it's not impossible, because again, just the way you're speaking, just the information that you're sharing at a specific point might help the person to gain your trust and give you information. And this rapport is influenced by 3 important variables. There are, in actual fact, the recent research indicates about 15 to 16 new variables, but the basic ones are empathy, where you try to understand what a person is going through; congruency, being genuine, where your verbal and non-verbal cues link with each other; and unconditional positive regard, where you don't judge the person. So research indicates if you apply these 3 variables, the person will trust you. It's not an airy-fairy thing. It's true. It's been researched. It's been tried and tested. You can build rapport by applying the 3 variables. You can gain that trust. Now, the person-centered approach has a very basic structure. It's got the beginning, the middle, and the end phase. And you start off with open questions and move towards close-ended questions, which might be of importance for us when we merge these 2. And then the PEACE model is that suggestive acronym which I talked about: preparation and planning, engagement and explaining, account, clarify and challenge, closure of the interview, and evaluation. I think most of you know the PEACE model, but let's just have a look at it again. If you, in the Zoom setting, obviously there's going to be some preparation and planning before the interview. And we'll touch on that also now when we apply it in today's virtual settings. Engage and explain is where here it's important to create the context of why you are there. Now, a lot of our students struggle to apply this with the practical that we give them at honors level. When they walk in to talk to the suspect, they forget to create the context of why they are there, who are they, and explain why it's necessary that the person talk to them. And here, rapport might play an important part. The second or the third aspect is account. That's where we account what the responsibilities are of the person. We clarify it. We make sure we understand what their responsibilities are, and we challenge. And then the closure of the interview and evaluation. So I think this, again, forgive my colors there, but hopefully it helps us. So if we try to take this structure of the PEACE model and we apply the person-centered approach, the content thereof, by also referring to the kinetic interviewing technique, it might help us to create this a technique that will help us, in essence, to get information also in a virtual setting. So preparation and planning, self-explanatory. You have to prepare beforehand. You have to have the evidence with you. You have to know what type of questions you're going to ask. Normally, and I think you will concur, you will try to talk to the suspect at the end of the investigation where you have most of your evidence. Engage and explain why they're there, and the context thereof. Again, rapport, very important. And here, those variables play an important part, that blue circle. So when we engage and explain, it might be very helpful to apply the variables of the person-centered approach. Remember, the PEACE model doesn't have the variables. So if we apply effectively empathy, congruency, and unconditional positive regard, the chances are that we will be able to create a setting where there's trust, where there's rapport. And the moment you have rapport, you can move forward and you can ask more important questions with regards to your investigation. Note here in that gray block, to help us identify the variables, we can look at those kinetic cues. If you say something about rugby, it's a very elementary example, I know. But if you know the person loves rugby and you want to start talking about rugby, you can see, even if it's on a Zoom meeting and you have your camera on, hopefully, you can see whether this person, how he or she reacts, positively or negatively. Again, if you struggle with those basic kinetic cues, one will need a workshop to identify them. And I think there is some room for a workshop like that. But humanistic natures of such nature, we will in most cases, be able to see whether a person experiences discomfort or whether he's excited or happy, or what type of reaction you might get from that person. So it's important at the engage and explain level to also take into account those kinetic cues. And normally, when we again apply the person-centered approach, approach it with an open-ended question type of approach. So no yes or no questions. Let the person talk. When you gain this trust as part of the rapport process. And then this third part, the account, clarify, and challenge, I've broken those up into those three parts. When you account, again, you identify the responsibilities of the person, for example. Where was he at that? What is he responsible for? If you know that the money or the deception or the money has been stolen in a specific time frame, then it's important to account what that person is responsible for and at what time periods, so that you know whether he was there at that time. So you find out from his version of what his responsibilities are, what his facts are, according to the interviewee. Again, these are normally, if we apply the person-centered approach, more open-ended questions. Then we clarify, the facts have been supplied by the interviewee, and we clarify if there are additional questions that we want to find out. And this is where we may ask open-ended questions, but we move more towards closed-ended questions at the back part of the clarification process. So you said, for example, you have responsibility of all the suppliers. You have the responsibility of keeping the supplying list up to date. Let's say, for example, that is the investigation you're busy with. You said that now. I just want to clarify, are you the only person, or are there other persons who are also responsible for keeping up the supplying of the supplying lists of the company? So that is the clarify area, or the aspects. And then the last aspect is to challenge. Now, I think a lot of the naysayers of the person-centered approach and the peace model says it's too kumbaya, there's too much congruency. But in actual fact, we forget that as part of the peace model, the challenge phase is there to challenge. So you have the responsibility, you have the information, the facts according to the interviewee. And normally those are basic facts where he doesn't even need to lie. Now you can challenge. So you give your facts as part of your investigation. Remember, we said mostly it'll help us if we do this, if we apply this technique. We talk to the suspect at the end of the interviewing technique. That will be, in most cases, the best. So once you have all the evidence that you needed for an investigation, there you challenge. And there it's not a case of being nice, it's being challenging and asking the tough questions. And you should do that. It's part of the person and the peace, person-centered approach and the peace model. And here the kinetic cues are very important, that background of the kinetic cues. Here you will be able to identify the discomfort, and you may ask follow-up questions. How you do that is a whole workshop in itself. We'll touch on some of these aspects now when we look at the Zoom session and how it influences this hybrid technique. But that is the essence. So you challenge and you look for discomfort. After you've went through this rest of these processes as part of the peace model, the structure, and you've applied the content, you challenge. So that is important. The next slide is where we close off the interview. Very important to identify the state of the interviewee. And here the kinetic cues plays an important part. If the person is distraught after admitting to a very wide-ranging type of economic crime, it's important to test the state of the interviewee, to find out whether the person is okay, whether he needs additional help or support from someone, whether you can call someone to help. Again, in the Zoom session, it makes it a bit more difficult, but there are ways. Asking whether he or she has any additional questions. It's important to close off the interview in that form. And then if the person admits, and I know in the virtual setting, you have to preferably have a written statement, and that'll be very difficult in most instances when you're having a Zoom interview, because obviously you're not there. And we'll talk about that now in a slide to follow. So here, normally also open-ended questions. Is there anything more that you want to share from your side when you talk to the interview, for example? Close off and again, we'll talk about the application just now. And then lastly, evaluation. And again, here I find a lot of interviewers in practice, also that is Prof. Gabbett's assessment in the UK even, is that we have problems with interviewers evaluating themselves afterwards. So the person is not critical enough of saying, what did he do right or what did he do wrong afterwards? And therefore we can't develop our interviewing skills in the process because we don't identify what needs development. And here also, we're going to talk about this when we talk about the practical steps, is it's important to, when you're two interviewers, to afterwards call each other, talk to each other and ask, hey, tell me, what did I do right according to you? What can I work on? To be honest there. Obviously, positive critical feedback and being honest, but not being mean, because then nobody would want to do interviews anymore. Okay, so let's break those aspects, the structure that we dealt with now with the hybrid technique, with the content, let's break them down in a more practical aspects of the Zoom sessions, for example, that you might have with again, it might be a client or process owner or even the suspect. I'm just going to touch on this because I think Jackie will also talk a lot about this. But it's the same as with any interview when you do preparation and planning. You're not going to walk into that interview, walk onto that computer screen and not be prepared. So you're going to have all your evidence and you're going to have it in an electronic form. And again, it becomes difficult because what now if the suspect says, who says that is that's the true content of what you've actually gained from the investigation, who says that is the original document. So it depends on the circumstance, but there might be a way of you trying to, where you can try to share the original documents or a scanned version thereof. But again, if you gain the trust of that person, you do this technique right. In a lot of instances, where you have that empathy, congruency, and unconditional positive regard, it doesn't help the person to, in the end, start to try and say what is the originality of that document because he's already admitted to so much of his responsibilities in the process. Assess the facts you already know as part of the preparation and planning. Obviously, keep records, evidence close. Again, you're not going to do this and say, okay, so on this page, can you see there? You have to have it in electronic form. That's important. Take into account the technological implications. Test your microphone beforehand. I did it last night with my brother-in-law. It was very nice of him to do it 10 o'clock last night with a 2-month or month-old baby to help me out, just to test the microphone. Does my camera work? Try to get one of these webcams. There's none of them in Potch. I've searched everywhere, so I'm actually using my cell phone. Make sure your cell phone and laptop is charged. It sounds so elementary and basic, but it's important things to take into account when you do the planning phase of this interview. Let's look at some practical aspects regarding the engage and explain part of this merge technique. Is to test, again, the volume of your speaker when you talk to the person. If the person cannot hear you, remember you are an active participant, then you will not get the reliable information you want. Also, make sure you can hear him or her clearly, that the camera is clear. And I want to reiterate, if the camera is not clear, that person is talking to you from a Nokia 3310. Okay, obviously that doesn't have a camera, but you know what I'm trying to say. Is stop the interview, say, let's try this again tomorrow. Please find another camera where I can see you, because how can you test the cues if you can't see the person? So that's important. The room and environment is very important when you engage and explain. If you sit in a dark room with a flashlight on your face, that'll probably not create the warm environment you want when you try to gain the trust as part of the report process. And this goes for both aspects, you as the interviewer and you as the interviewee. And obviously, as part of this engage and explain process, it's very important to test the cues, the kinetic cues. See how the person is responding already from the engage and explain process as part of looking into the camera when you're doing the Zoom session or the Skype session. When we do the virtual interview as part of the account clarify and challenge process, don't forget to still have your notebook with you. I mean, if the person gives you information, or write it down on the Word document of your laptop. It's important to still have a notebook and take note of what the person is saying, so that you can later challenge the person. If you forget what he said, how can you challenge him? So these are basics to remember, even if you have a virtual interview. Again, let's touch on that again. It's in most instances better to be two persons in an interview, and I would find it a lot more comfortable if I have another interviewer with me conducting the interview. Now, you've seen the chaos with some of these Zoom meetings, everybody talking at the same time, not knowing that a person's actually there, and then he's sitting there for the whole time. You've seen that funny video. So a nice way of actually communicating with each other is keep your cell phone with you and talk via WhatsApp with your colleague while you are interviewing the person, so that if there is something you missed, that your colleague can ask it, and you can give each other chances to actually speak. So allow both interviewers time for questions. Again, share the screen when you challenge, as I'm doing now. Share the screen, share the facts on the screen so that the person can see it. And then the whole essence of what you want to do when you challenge, even in the virtual setting, is you said this, and I clarified it more than once, but the facts suggest otherwise. Here are the facts. It's important to show the facts. If the person can't see it, then you're in trouble. Okay, so the basics is let the interview speak and don't talk on his or her behalf in the virtual setting as well, because you might feel, because of the distance that is created through the Zoom meeting, that you are it feels a bit awkward and the person is struggling to find his words. You might feel the need to chip in and to say, oh, you're trying to say this, you're trying to say that. And that's something that I see a lot of with nice people and honest people, our students as well. They try to make it as easy as possible, and they forget to challenge, and they forget to let the person speak. Let the person speak and dig his or her own grave. Again, we're not doing this investigation or this interview to gain the guilt or the confession of the person, but we're there to find out the reliable information. But let the person talk. It's very important as part of this Account and Clarify challenge, even in the virtual setting. And then when we close off, move towards open-ended questions again. Once you've moved towards the close-ended, open it up again at the end. Allow the interview to elaborate before closing. We dealt with that. The big challenge, admission of guilt. What if the person admits and now he's sitting in Cape Town and you're in Johannesburg? Again, there are practical ways of asking the person, organizing a situation where the person can give a sworn statement of what he just told you, but it's going to be very difficult in most instances. And what the research also indicates is that once a person has admitted, the longer you take to take that written statement, the longer or the more risky it is that the person will retract his statements. So here I think recording the Zoom session might be of great worth, because then it is on record, and the person, if he retracts it, we have evidence to suggest that that's not the case. Again, it might be hearsay, it might influence the admissibility of the evidence, might become an issue in the court, but it's still probably a lot better to record it in the end. And again, the legal implications is a whole new discussion, which the other experts will help us with. And remember to take into account the statutory laws that apply when you record something. So the essence is the same as whether you're recording it in a physical session or you are recording it as part of a virtual session. Now we only have the camera screen as well, which can help us when we provide evidence as part of the investigation. And then I mentioned this, evaluate it afterwards. Talk to each other, be honest. I promise you it's going to make you a better interview if you talk about it afterwards. And I find this is lacking a lot in practice. General remarks, I see my time is up. General remarks is, we dealt with this. Do we record the Zoom session? Yes. I would say yes. I would like to hear the legal experts, what they say about this. But there are legal implications you have to take into account, specifically some of those statutory laws. And the admissibility thereof will be influenced in the sense of that you will have to testify about that recording, the person who records it. So it becomes a bit more technical, but I'd say it's rather be safe and record the session, and obviously with the permission of the person you're interviewing. Okay, and that's my session. What I just want to end off with is, it's not ideal to do a virtual session, and I think Jackie will also elaborate on that. It will always be better to have a physical interview with the person who's sitting in front of you, because you can gain the trust easier, you can share the information that you have easier, you can just create the setting a lot easier than a virtual setting. But if it's not necessary, or it's not possible for you to have this physical interview, it is possible to use this virtual setting to actually get reliable information. There's no doubt. There is room for additional research, but if you apply these basic concepts that we just dealt with now, I'm sure that you will at least have information at the end that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have the virtual session. Yes, so that's my couple of words. I don't know whether there are questions now. I think some of you asked questions on the chat area, and I'll get back to that now, or as soon as possible. I don't know, Chris, how you want to use the session now before Jackie starts, or how we will deal with this.
Well, let's go through the questions first. There's some questions on the chat side of it. So if you can see the chat and read it, then you can just respond to that. If you want me to read it for you. Andre McDonald's raising his hand. So Andre, you can go
ahead. Yes, hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, I can hear you, Andre.
Just with regards to the self-assessment interviews, I just wonder, in terms of, I mean, in the past, I'm just giving an example now, when you get tip-off anonymous emails coming through, often the people provide very limited information based on their knowledge or understanding of what they think is needed. So I'm just wondering about the reliability of an SAR in terms of obtaining as much information as possible, pertinent information as possible. And then not only that, what is your views on an SAR if it came to, say, perjury? I mean, the admissibility of that in say a legal a criminal justice environment, and then let's say there's something that they perjured themselves within that SAR. Could you use that in terms of perjury? Sorry, there's quite a bit there that I threw in.
No, I just written these down. Okay, so firstly, with regards to the SAI, what you said where you get more cryptic type of information that you will receive. Yes, that's a good point. But what I want to tell you, Andrea, is that they're busy now with this process of, it's actually it's been, I think they started now, it's the second month that applying the SAI in London on a great level or scale. And they're actually busy with that research. So what I'm going to do is in the next couple of months, I'm going to talk to Prof. Gabbett and hear whether we can get insight into that information, what their challenges are in terms of that. So I'll be hesitant to say how it will work in our setting because we don't have enough research in our context. But let's hear what she has to say. I'm going to talk to her, and then I think I'll share her research with the ICFP as well in the near future. With regards to perjury in the SAI, again, it depends on how you apply the SAI in the South African context. So I don't even want to answer that question in sense of applying it in terms of perjury and admissibility, because obviously you have to look at the perjury itself, the criminal law aspect thereof. But before we can ask that question, we have to know how it's going to be applied. And I don't have the answer for that. So I'm waiting for that specific research now from London. So if that's, sorry, it's a broader, it's a vague answer, but the fact is, I don't know how it's going to be applied, if we apply it. It's just something I wanted to share what the new types of interviewing techniques that we're looking at and maybe applying in the future in the economic crime sense.
That's fine. Can I ask one other question? I know I'm
yes.
Just in terms of interviewing and more of an interrogation, leverage. When it comes to leverage, when you're using leverage, whether you're threatening criminal prosecution or civil action, how far should one go in terms of applying pressure? Where's the line that you're crossing over when it then becomes under duress? And one more question is white lies in an interview by the interviewer. What's your view on that when you putting certain things to the person, to the suspect, that you want them to believe that they think you're aware of, that's actually a lie? What's your views there?
Very interesting aspects you're touching on now. When it comes to, it becomes so easy to place a person under so much pressure, as you mentioned, that the person feels as if he's under duress. I think the central concept to apply there is to be repetitive as to why the person is there. We created that context at the beginning, but we can apply that context throughout the session. And that's what the research also indicates. If you, again, go back to, remember, you don't have to be here, but obtaining reliable information as part of the whole process will, in essence, help the whole process of finding out the truth. And as you said in the beginning of this interview, you are willing to share that truth. So that's, again, it forms part of the rapport. It's very gray. It depends on the circumstances. Again, how much is too much pressure? And again, I think there's no clear answer of that. But I think what I find what helps is creating that context the whole time of the repetitive notion of saying, again, why are you here? Remember, you can leave. You can leave if the person wants to leave. But again, as I mentioned, there should be pressure. It's part of specifically when you challenge. There's no reason there shouldn't be pressure because you're challenging their narrative versus your narrative, and we want to find out the truth. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all, Andre. I wish I could say that we either have this log or this model which you apply and all this. It depends, because it's a humanistic psychology, it depends on what happens from the interviewee or the interviewer side. And then with regards to the second question, it was, it was again I can't read my own writing here.
White lies.
Oh, the white lies. As far as possible, I would stay clear from white lies even, because it might influence the admissibility. Remember, the whole reason why we're trying to do this interview is to gain evidence, reliable information that we can present in front of a court of law. The moment that that interviewee makes it clear that you used lies and he comes aware of, even if it's white lies, I'm not a fan of it. I know some of the people in practice and I've talked to do use some type of form of white lies to get to the truth. I'm not a supporter. Again, if you've established those three variables and you've established the context and you've gained the trust, I believe in a lot of instances it's not even necessary to lie in any, whether it's white lies or not, in any context or setting.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I just want to open a Chris. I don't know why. I think I should close this. I want to see whether the questions on the. Okay, there we have it.
Constant, some of the questions that have been asked before has been answered by you now. In terms of admissibility, another question was asked: what happens if the line is dropped while you're interviewing? I think it's a technical issue. You can't do anything about it. You're going to have to start and see if you can reschedule a meeting. It's part of life. It's reality.
Yes. And then I see there's a question about the slides, just a practical thing. Chris, I'm sure we were able to share the slides.
We will do so. Are there any other questions?
You answered that already?
Yes.
And then, so I do see if a person. Okay, that you already answered that from Ramatsimela. Again, Jackie will cover that with movement restrictions. The reason for There's a long question. Did we deal with this with movement restrictions?
No, we didn't.
Dealing with the interview. Not be at the site to conduct an interview. Yes, we are arranging Zoom interviews with one of our investigators sitting in without participating with the interviews. So I pressed enter too fast. The reason for having a person sit in is to ensure that there is no potential interference from other parties on the interviewee. I don't really understand the question.
Rhoda was just making a remark there, just answering.
Yeah. I agree. Okay, so it's good, and it links with what I said. I think it's always better to have two persons as part of the interview. But again, that second person must feel free to ask questions, but he has to have the opportunity. And again, if you use Zoom, it might be there might be some technical aspects to take into consideration. So reading session in chapter lost. Okay, we dealt with that. What happens? Reschedule the interview. If it's possible, try to go on. If you know the chances are you won't get that person again, try to connect as soon as possible. Otherwise, reschedule.
Nico is asking, do you have to inform an interviewee when recording electronic interview?
Yes, definitely.
Yes, you have in terms of.
But again, I'm not an expert in the statutory laws when it comes to when to. And again, there's a lot of experts who disagree on when to inform and how to inform of specifically the rights of, or the person is incriminating themselves. It becomes vague sometimes, and we don't have a clear answer also in research. But you have to certainly inform the person that you're recording the interview. For admissibility.
Like Prof. David de Villiers always saying, if you ask for permission, if he says yes, you press a button on the top. If he says no, you press a button behind the table. But in terms of RICA, there are requirements.
Yes, exactly, RICA.
Yeah, then there are certain exclusions for recording, and there are certain times when you can record it. So just go through the RICA Act. There is some clear descriptions of what you can do. I think, if I can remember correctly, we're talking about section 4 of RICA, that said that any person other than a law enforcement officer may intercept any communication if he or she is party to the communication. So you must be party to that communication, but obviously the best thing is to get written consent and try and get consent from a person, but there is a walkway around it.
Chris, maybe if I could help out there. So you're actually correct when you state that it is a regulation in RICA, and where two parties are part of that conversation, both of them have the right to record. You don't have to inform the person. However, when it comes to the law, it is preferable always to inform a party that you are recording. The reason being, especially when it comes to the labor law, for some other mysterious reason, it's frowned upon if you do not inform people. I've been through that situation, and especially people that don't have a forensic background say, no, you should inform. So as a rule, inform the person, not only of the nature of why you're recording, but also of the fact that you are recording both the audio and the video, because we're dealing with two things when we deal with online interviews, both audio and video.
Sorry, Jackie, I've just unmuted myself. Yes, I remember you correct. I remember there was a case, State versus, I think it was Kitson in 1999, where this aspect was dealt with, and the judge at that time held that the purpose of the act was to protect communications from communications. And we're talking about specific the RICA side. It was to protect, it will be allowed in evidence, but the act was to protect communication from eavesdropping and not from participants. So that description. So not from participants, but from eavesdropping. So yeah, interesting stuff.
Okay, then I see there's a question from Ramatsumela regarding the MIT, the Morgan interview technique. Very good question, and it's one of those techniques which forms part of the investigative interviewing technique, but it's one of those techniques that is not actually seen as the main interviewing techniques. That's why we didn't actually refer to that. The answer is we need a lot more research regarding the Morgan interview type of technique, specifically in the South African context. Very exciting, and I've got a couple of students looking at that also. So yes, so I can't vouch for it yet, but I'm definitely looking into it. It looks very interesting.
Okay, Jackie, thank you, Constant. We appreciate your time and effort. I'm going to hand over to Jackie. Jackie, I think you've got some war stories and interesting things to tell us. So please, yeah, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for this opportunity. I know people usually expect slides from me. You're not going to get that today. In the first instance, when it comes to online interviews, I want to share some of the experience that I have, not only in conducting webinars and doing TV interviews and how to engage with people, but I think there is very important aspects. I always say you have to clean the house before you start working on these type of interviews. So practical considerations. The first thing is, what platform am I going to use? Everybody talks about Zoom. Everybody talks about Zoom bombings. I think it's a wonderful tool. Most of the people are using it for the simple reason that it's free. Remember, when you use Zoom, there's a restriction. When there's three or more people, three or more, you're restricted to an interview of 45 minutes, no more. So consider that, especially in the environment where you have more than one interviewee taking part in these kind of things. So the other thing, a practical consideration is the person that you're interviewing. Who's going to pay for his data? To most people, that might sound immaterial unless you're interviewing somebody that's on prepaid and doesn't have fiber at home. The connectivity issue, make sure that you establish beforehand that there's a reliable type of connection here. In most instances, remember one thing: if you record video, which I would advise you to do, video takes more bandwidth than just the audio. As I said in the question now, we need to understand that when we deal with an online interview, there's two components. The one is the video, the other one is the audio. And I like to explain that in the context of fake news. Say, for example, somebody takes footage and they manipulate it. They might manipulate the video and not necessarily the audio, or vice versa. So be very careful to record both and understand that you're dealing with, sorry, let me just turn off my phone. Very important, turn off your phone. So be very careful what the aim is and what exactly do you want to achieve. Practice. Not all of us are on the same level of technology skills. So this is not only important for the interviewer, but also for the interviewee. So what I have done is, if I have somebody that's not technologically advanced, I would suggest that you have a practice run with this person even before you go into the interview, not only to test your side of the connection, but also just to make that person familiar about what it is to have an online interview. The other thing is, remember, you don't always see your own face and the other person doesn't see his face. So it does become a bit disjointed. When you, for example, deal with a program like Microsoft Teams, it's the craze to have an electronic background. Just remember one thing, that especially when you have an electronic background or a backdrop, it tends to distort. The moment you start moving, it looks like frozen in time. The last thing you need is, because you're using technology to make that person think he's speaking to somebody that's stuck in the matrix. So I would not use a backdrop when I do these type of interviews. One of the most important things that we need to do first is explain why you're having the interview. Even if you've done it in person, it needs to be recorded. Do I record? Yes, you record. And you tell the person that you are recording and what is the purpose of that recording. So when I talk now, I'll deal with witness interviews, and I'll deal with interviewing a suspect a bit later. So I tell the person a short summary of the investigation. I tell them that I have requested this meeting. I tell them what the time is, and I start my interview. When it comes to the admissibility of this type of recording, currently, I would advise you to basically use your recording of the interview the same as you would with taking interview notes. Is it possible to use this to substitute an affidavit? Probably, but it's going to open up a can of worms. So getting back to the setup, you need to understand that if you want to use something like this as the sole piece of evidence to basically take over the purpose of taking down an affidavit, you're going to have to prove it as a data message in terms of the ECT Act. So then immediately in terms of the ECT Act, we're looking at the admissibility and the reliability of this recording. If you don't have the means of ensuring that I can prove that that evidence is reliable, nobody tampered with it, nobody cut it, nobody edited it, you're going to have to record it in such a fashion that it is forensically sound. So what I would advise you, if you don't have that kind of infrastructure, if your computer is not set up in that way and you don't have all the fancy bells and whistles that's needed to ensure that that video recording is forensically sound, use it as interview notes, use it as the basis from which you're going to do your witness affidavit. When it comes to preparation, it's even more important when it comes to an online environment. Everybody is unfamiliar. You as the interviewer is going to be the person that takes the lead, that has to make the witness feel calm, feel collected, and you can only do that if you're confident in what you are doing yourself. So a lot of this interview and the success of the interview is going to depend on how you do this. And I would advise you, there are some computer programs out there where you can do a screenshot, go and practice. If you don't want to practice or you don't have anybody else to practice with, go and see where your screen should be. How should I tilt it? If I can just show you the difference in between tilting it. Limit your hand movements, for example. It's distracting. The other thing is practice your tone. Listen to how your voice sounds. Listen how fast you must speak and how slow you must speak. Take into account that you might have to sometimes slow down your speech a bit. If the person has a bad connection on the other side, what's going to happen? It's going to distort. You don't want that. One of the questions that was raised, Constant, whilst you were talking was, what do I do if the guy wants to leave? I mean, we all are fey with the rules. Don't lock a suspect or a witness in a room. They have to feel free to leave when they want. But it sort of gets a bit more difficult when you have an online interview and the guy can kill his connection and there goes the interview. And herein lies your technique as an interviewer to keep that person engaged. And we also need to establish bathroom breaks. You need to make provision for a person wanting to make a cup of coffee. If he wants to go and make a cup of coffee, let him do it or let her do it, but don't terminate the session. And note, on that session, the person has requested to leave and just to make a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom. These things might become important. And also where a person says, I've had enough. You know what? This is not working for me. Note it in your interview. If you don't have the means of recording and it has a time and date stamp, say at 11:45, Jackie got up and she said she's now hotful of this webinar and she wants to leave. Make those notes available. One of the things, and before I forget, because at my age, we do forget, is when we deal with an interview, don't use deception. Don't use deception and don't do something that can later be regarded as undue influence. I know people prefer doing it, but I don't know how many of you have stood in a court and dealt with trials within a trial. One of the main grounds that I will attack a statement or a confession is usually based on undue influence. You promised me something. You sort of said to me, if I don't tell you this, I'm going to be locked up. My family's going to lose their income and so forth. So by doing that, you put that whole affidavit or that whole piece of evidence into question. And the last thing you need, especially in a very complicated matter, is to get involved in technicalities, where I first have to prove to the court that you have to listen to this based on the following things. It distracts. And the last thing you need is a crucial point, a piece of evidence being disregarded in a court because of the fact that you used interview techniques like this, and the question was around the admissibility of that. Getting to the distinction between a witness interview and a suspect. For me, at this stage, I would still prefer, when I deal with an interview of a suspect, to do it online, to do it in person. There's nothing prohibiting you from doing it. The other thing is, I cannot tell you how many times I've sat through a witness interview and then it came out that the person is actually an accomplice and I'm actually sitting with my mind suspect and I thought I was interviewing a witness. So always keep in mind that things might change. How do I keep the person engaged? Getting back to the planning. Not many people do preparation. I know there's a lot of interviewers that prefer not to have a few standard questions prepared before. I'm different. I study my witness. I always have a strategy with my whole investigation, and I decide that specific witness is going to provide evidence on point A or B or C. I prepare for that, and I have a few standard questions to just help me through this interview, but also to make sure that, because I'm in a strange environment now and I'm talking to a screen and not a person, at least if I do get stuck, I can just refer to my notes and I still have a point to go on. Your questions, however, must not be so restrictive. And you tend to find this with people that haven't been interviewing for a long time, that all they ask is the questions that they prepared. They can't sort of use that as an introductory question leading to other things. They do get stuck. So practice on that, but plan your interview. For the people that are more skilled, it is possible to conduct this interview. Let's say, for example, you use Microsoft Teams. And you can't do this on the free version. You're going to have Microsoft Teams as part of your Microsoft Enterprise package. But you can actually, when you are skilled enough, sit with a person and compile your affidavit whilst you've got that person in a session. I would advise against it if you're not comfortable, if the other person is not comfortable. Rather just record and use the recording as your interview notes and tell the person, okay, we've now concluded the interview. You've had the opportunity to speak. Is there anything else? And then inform the person that what I'm going to do right now is I'll help you draft your affidavit, or if you feel comfortable, please draft the affidavit for me, put everything in writing, and then have it commissioned. So the law. There's nothing at this stage that precludes us from having online interviews. I think the trick is going to come when we want to present this type of recordings in a court of law and we sort of didn't follow the right steps. Just remember that we still have the Constitution. In terms of Section 36, evidence that is obtained in an unconstitutional matter can be allowed if it is in the interest of justice. There have been some case law that says one of the considerations you have to take into account is why this evidence would have been inadmissible and why it is in the interest of justice. And if you think that piece of evidence away, does it vitiate the whole proceeding? Classical example here is if you have a pointing out and the person was coerced to go and point it out by means that we can't usually employ online, but he pointed out a body in a place that nobody would ever have known. So the court can consider to allow that evidence in the interest of justice, but it can get a bit technical and we have to try and avoid those kind of technical arguments. Cases at this stage is so difficult to do. As I said before, you do not want to land up in a situation where most of your time in a court is spent arguing technicalities on the admissibility and the reliability of the evidence. Duration. Because we, in an online environment, if you get onto speed, you tend to just go on and on and on. You don't read a person's body language. So take breaks. Ask the person constantly, are you comfortable? Do you want to take a break? If the person does take a break, don't kill the video. That might, for example, the video and the audio, it might at one stage, if the person says, you know what, you altered it, it creates difficulty. Also, if the connection is dropped and you log back on, then note that the connection was dropped on the side of the interviewee or the interviewer at such and such a date and time, and we've now reestablished. And just to be safe, say to the person, we are now continuing the interview and this case. And remember one thing, because you're not looking at each other, record as much as possible of what your actions is. The good news is that your interview techniques online doesn't change. It doesn't change. It is for you to, in your head and in your mind, realize that the only thing that's different here is that I'm talking through a computer to somebody. The person is not sitting across in the room. Nothing's changed. So do I adapt my interview techniques? Not the way that I question, not the way that I conduct the interview. The only thing that's going to change here is you, because you're going to have to convince the person that he's actually or she is actually sitting across from you. And that is where the skill comes in. So some of the other techniques that you could employ here is, once you've done that interview, say for example you've interviewed a suspect that didn't want to say everything that you wanted to, or you've got somebody that contradicts himself. What is nice about using online is that I have the option now, for example, to use software such as voice stress analysis. But again, if you want to do that and you think that you're going to use that in a court of law, you're probably going to have to warn the person about that. But I don't think many people have access to that kind of technology. It does come at a cost. What I would advise people to do right now is, I think this virus is going to be with us for a while, but even if the pandemic is over, I think that the way that we've worked has ended, and that I would actually prefer that more of these type of interviews is done online. From a business perspective, it makes sense because it cuts out a lot of travel costs, and also it enables you to schedule more interviews because now it's not office bound, it's not hours bound and things like that. So you might be able to interview a CEO more readily via a video conference because his day or her day is so full. So take a little bit of money and invest in a good webcam, invest in a screen. If you can use 2 screens, it makes it a bit easier. Practice with that so that you can drag and drop between the screens. One thing that I forgot to touch on is, what do I do with documents? So this comes with the preparation, because remember now, I don't have the guy coming in with a bunch of files. So if possible, see that most of the documents that you're going to discuss, you can PDF. If you can't PDF them, have them couriered. Make 2 copies, and important, number them beforehand. Because remember, you're not going to sit with this person now and number it, and because you're not sitting together, it might create some confusion and to and fro, and you don't want the person to break that concentration with you on the screen. What we have found in the courts with even lockdown, a lot of the matters have been like unopposed appeals, and matters that could be settled on pleadings have been done online. So the courts are not opposed at this stage to going into the digital space, which is good news for us. But just in summary, guys, with whatever you do, make sure that you follow the right rules. Maybe what you can do is, within your company, go now and draft a standard operating procedure which complies with international best practice of how an interview should be conducted online. So it might just help you as well, firstly, to inform your staff, and especially the junior people, of what is expected and how it should be done. But it can also help you later on to say, I've got an approved policy that was reviewed by my legal department, bloody, bloody, and to prove that you actually did what you were supposed to do. So that's it from me. Questions?
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, this is a great question from Andres about recording of an interview. He says he's asking, can I record an interview person and have that person have the recording transcribed and then send it to the person to sign as true a reflection that was of the recording?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's actually it's one of the best practices. That's what I would do when I conduct an interview.
No, it's definitely a valid question. And I mean, I had a conversation yesterday with Advocate Paul Lowe, and we said that for us, I mean, I still talk as an old prosecutor, there's nothing wrong in doing that. So the transcription probably is going to cost you a bit if you don't do it yourself. But remember one thing, what you do then is you share your interview recording with the person and say to them, this is how I transcribed it. You're welcome to listen. Just say to me that this is a true reflection of what had been discussed during our interview.
Great. Are there any other questions from other participants?
Chris, just from my side, Jacqueline here.
Thank you.
I think the important part is still to get statements under oath in writing, even of this interview process, that we don't burden the record with too much of the stuff. So where you can still have the recordings or even call recordings, and then put it down to a statement. Even if the person doesn't want a statement, it's always nice to send him a report, as you said. And if he confirms it, it just makes your case a bit stronger against the accused person.
Jaco, you've raised a very valid thing there. I mean, if we go back to post-COVID life, what I used to do is I'll tell the people that I record for purposes of my notes so that I can refer back to it when we draft an affidavit where I'm in the position that I actually help the witness to draft the affidavits. And you actually want to end up, if we in court, we don't always use our interview notes. We use our affidavits because it is sworn and it's attested to. But the same with a video recording here and an audio recording. You want to use it as backup. I don't think our South African law is yet developed to the point like with American law where you have that whole deposition things. But even with a deposition, what do you end up? You go and say to the person that we reduce it to writing, it is attested to, it is commissioned, and so forth. So, yeah, I would say use this recording as your backup, not as your main source of evidence.
Jackie, Tabu Muketi is raising her hand. Tabu, are you welcome to go ahead?
All right. I just wanted to ask, if let's say you're using the Microsoft Teams, for instance, if you want to show the person, the interviewee, your information which you are asking about, will it be safe that all the electronic documents, you save them on the Microsoft Teams so that it makes it easier for you to show the interviewee that these are the kind of documents that you are asking about? And furthermore, with regards to writing a statement, can you also write those statements directly showing the person what you're writing so that you can be in agreement with that person?
Very interesting question. Firstly, let me deal with the easy part. This comes in Tabu where you have to do your preparation before. So have the folder open. It doesn't take so much time for you to access the documents. Like with Microsoft Teams, you have that option of shared folders and stuff. The problem that you sit with Microsoft Teams, the person that you're interviewing is not necessarily going to be part of your team. So it's, again, on the enterprise version, you'll be inviting that person as an external party. Yes, you can show them the documents online. You can do this with Zoom as well. We saw now share your screen. Just remember, when you share your screen, see that you've opened up that folder. It just makes it so much easier if you have to share your screen, if it's already open and you don't have to fuddle around to find your document. I haven't actually seen, I'm going to, right now when we log off here, I'm going to test it to see whilst I'm typing in Word, if I can see what the other party is doing. I think you can. If I'm not mistaken, you can sit and you can edit live, but I need to go test it first and I'll let you know.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tabu. Thank you, Jackie. Any other questions? Well, it doesn't seem like it. So, Jackie, Constant, thank you so much. I've learned a lot. I think a lot of the delegates learned a lot. It's a topic that was current, and it's important that we discuss these issues. So for your time, Jackie, for short notice, I really do appreciate it. I owe you one once again. Constant, you as well. Every time I press a button in your name, you're available and prepared to assist. So thank you so much. To all the participants, we have another webinar here next week. The topic is business rescue and the role of the forensic practitioner in that regard. So it's going to be an interesting discussion with all the business rescue going on now with SAA, I know Econ, Hertz, and ComE. So please dial in and be safe and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you to everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Jackie. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Great insight.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you. Cheerio. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye. Ons dan baie dankie. Praat weer. Okay. Hi, Constant. Okay. Jy kan. Yes, hy by Netbank. Ek gaan gou vir jou dit stuur. Wil jy sy telefoonnommer en sy e-pos, wie al twee. En 100% ek sal vir jou e-pos. Dankie. Dit baie was goed, weet ek was kyk ek het jou lanklaas oor praat. Jy's 'n goeie presenter. Jy praat uit jou hart uit en uit jou kop uit. Dis die groot ding. Ek wens ek het daai skills gehad. Jy baie goed gegaan. Dit is maar weet wat jy nou gesê het, daar's een ding wat vir my nogal interessant was wat jy gesê het is dat die feit dat hulle in die UK nou jou klagte online kan doen, jy weet. Dit klink vir my so interessant hier. En ek sê ek sal gou vir Andries goed vir jou stuur. Okay, bye.